So, good afternoon and welcome to our closing plenary, which is on moving forward, which of course is the most important thing, really. Before I turn the microphone over to Heidi Hartman and our panelists, I have some people that I want to thank. So first of all, I want to thank you, all of you who came here to share your research and your ideas and thoughts and comments and energy and all of those things. Next, I want to thank the program committee who put together the panels from an enormous number of submissions that we got. So Mahmoud Yusuf, Jessica Light, and Evan Kraft, who are professors at American University. Our PhD students, Regina Seo and Brittany Wiltshire, who are also here. And then from IWPR, Dr. Heidi Hartman, Dr. Barbara Galt, and Dr. Cynthia Hess. So I want to thank them for the really great panels. Also, I want to thank our volunteers. So let me just get my list here. Okay, so Nathan Allen, Kevin Tang, Audria Velinovich, Paola Roldan, Amy Seligson, Mariana Cardozo, Mariam Hamza, Alyssa Cohen, Madison Plazkowski, Lynn Shi, Samar Nadi, and then also our staff who helped with this project, and help is like just the biggest understatement. Shireen Arslan, Regina Seo, Abdullah Hussein, and Alex Zipper. So obviously we could not have done this without our volunteers. Then I want to thank two more people, Otko Bansrak, who started out as our conference manager until this past May when she went back to National University of Mongolia, where she is a former dean and a professor. And then last, but definitely not least, I want to thank Shireen Arslan. Shireen, where are you? Are you in here? Yeah, come in here. Come in here. So Shireen is our PGAE manager and also our conference manager. And Shireen, for you, I have just a tiny little under here. Don't worry, it's not a cat. Come in. Okay, all right. Now I am turning the microphone over to Heidi and the panel, and I'm going to try to bring Karen up so she can be here more fully. In a word, oops, there we go. Do I need to do something with that button, or it's good?
Yeah, if we could turn the lights down, that would be great. Karen, how are you? Thank you for coming. It's a delayed reaction. We see your wave behind your picture, but not in your picture.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I can't be there in person.
Well, thank you very much. Well, it's a delight to be the co-host of this conference and to be standing in front of you at this time. And can we turn more lights down in the room? Then we can see Karen better. Oh, now this is better. Yeah, this is better. So I do want to say that as much as people have come up to us and said, can we do this every year? I do want you to know that the support of the Open Society Foundation has been critical. And so far as we know, it's not going to be renewed. It was a grant to American University. We also want to thank the European Union Jean Monnet Fund, because they have given us the second grant at IWPR to allow us to bring leaders from around the world together. And the College of Arts and Sciences at AU also contributed substantially to the costs of the conference. But of course, all of you contributed the most. So I have to second Mika's thanks. And now it is my pleasure to present our panel. The order is going to be Kate Bond, who's an economist at the Center for Equitable Growth, Shara Razavi, who's Chief of Research and Data at UN Women, Karen Groen, Senior Director for Gender, World Bank Group, and John Schmidt, Vice President at Economic Policy Institute. And we thank all of you for coming, and especially Karen, you're making a great effort, so thank you very much. And now we're going to start. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited about this panel where we're talking about policy moving forward. And so for this, I'm going to sort of focus on some framing, so how framing can guide policy solutions, and get a little bit into policy solutions, but it's really much more about how we can frame gender equality in order to guide policy solutions. And in particular, I'm going to focus on paid care work, which isn't to say it's more important than looking at unpaid care work, but just to narrow our focus a little bit. And I think a lot of people in this room probably already know that care is really interconnected, and many of the reasons behind women are often held back in the economy, both their own caregiving responsibilities within their family, but more broadly as with gender socialization, gender norms that place an undue burden on women to do caretaking, as well as relate stereotypes to women as sort of natural caregivers rather than seeing these as valuable skills. And we also know because paid care work, just by sheer virtue of being associated with women, is paid less. The research from Paula England and others showed us that any given occupation that's associated with women will end up being paid less. But sort of taking a step back, looking at the economic theory, care is often really undervalued in mainstream economic theory. And it's designed, and economic theory is designed in such a way to relegate the long-term benefits of care, the social benefits of care, as secondary to short-term profits, market action. And this is something sort of Nancy Fulbright got in the opening plenary yesterday. A bit of it is because economics has such a big focus on what you can easily quantify and measure. And it's hard for economists to think a little bit more creatively about things that aren't as easy to measure as short-term profits. But I think, I would maybe disagree somewhat that it's, just immeasurable and hard to get at. I think sometimes this division between short-term economic profits or what is in the market versus what is sort of done within homes and done within families is a bit arbitrary. So I think economists can think a bit more broadly about how to measure care, how to do the interdisciplinary work that Nancy had alluded to. And if economists, particularly policy economists, broaden their imagination, develop a broader understanding of the value of care, theories and policies could be developed to support care work, and we could create narratives that could support more funding, more subsidies, more direct provision of care work. I think the closest corollary to this we can see is thinking about public goods in economic theory. To understand how there's these things in the economy that give broader benefits, and what we do when these things have broader benefits is we try to internalize those benefits by increasing the cost of it. So the benefits of effective care include a more productive and efficient economy, which would increase aggregate demand, and improve the economy that we all function in. We all share the benefits of an economy in which there's better care provision. So I'm going to go through a couple of specific examples to try to sort of elucidate what I'm thinking behind this. My first is looking at K through 12 teachers. I think this is sort of a pretty direct example of how we can invest more in care. If you consider K through 12 teachers a care profession, that will have more positive economic benefits in the economy. So we know that increasing the pay of teachers with across the board pay increases, which I'm saying is a contrast to market-based pay reforms for teachers, it increases future productivity of students in school. We currently have 51 million students in public schools in the US who could expect to see their future earnings increase with better human capital development. But better education access and quality will also improve productivity in the economy that everyone will benefit from. For example, there'd be better job matching since more students would have the opportunity to make unconstrained decisions about education and career paths that are better suited to them. So I'm thinking of things like the Raj Chetty work on lost Einsteins, where we're losing out on capacity of students who could go on to be really productive members of the economy, and that would increase aggregate demand and have a multiplier effect. We also know from research from Jesse Rothstein and others that more progressive funding for policies, more progressive funding policies for low-income areas improve student outcomes, and they gradually phase in a progressive way, so the improvements are bigger for lower-income students than they are for higher-income students. So school resources have a large effect on student achievement. We know that this is really important to having better outcomes for students. I'll have a caveat with the Rothstein work is that they find the impact is largely for class size, not teacher pay. But given that, I also think teacher pay is really important because it reduces teacher turnover, and it is really difficult to measure the quality of a teacher. But we do know that teacher tenure, is really positively associated with teacher quality. So anything we can do to keep teachers within their schools, within their classrooms for longer, is going to have a good impact on students. And progressive school funding also has distributional impacts on the broader economy. If you impute school funding in a progressive way as a measure of economic well-being for family units, we know that it reduces economic inequality if we have more progressive funding. But the fact of the matter is that considering all the benefits that teachers bring to sort of the long-term growth of the economy, they're not paid as much as they should, or it's sort of not being internalized. Teachers are paid $58,000 a year in the U.S. These are jobs that usually require a master's degree. So, Heidi had asked when she had written to us before about how we would cost some of these proposals. And so if we took the 3.6 million teachers, just like super back of the envelope, and said, I think they should all be paid $100,000. So we're nearly doubling their pay. And that would make a raise for all 3.6 million teachers of $42,000 is another $151 million per year for the federal government to be paying. If it should be done through a federal program, which I think it should, it would also require, in terms of like practical policy, it's a little bit difficult. I think we really need to have school funding be done through the federal government. Right now, only 10% of funding is provided through the federal government. It's provided through, otherwise it's through a combination, about half and half, state and local funding. So I think in order to actually put forward a policy proposal like this where we're paying all teachers $100,000, it would just be such a huge shift in how we fund school, but I still think it'd be really important. And I'm also going to briefly talk about like another example for how we can think through this is home care workers. This is something that Heidi has done a bunch of research on. So home care workers is a little bit harder of an argument to make in terms of the efficiency argument, how it improves sort of the efficiency and productivity of the economy, because a lot of people who are receiving home care are elderly or disabled. But just because it's not so directly obvious, I would still argue that it is really important and efficient, because well-provided care delays further degeneration. It's found to have huge emotional benefits as well, which is immensely valuable but harder to measure. And it's something that, this could be perhaps considered through interdisciplinary work of economists with other people like sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, social workers. But there are sort of ways, at least in the policy world, we can start to develop some narratives around the actual cost-saving benefit of having better provided care. We know that the median monthly payment for non-institutional care workers, that'd be home health care workers, is about $1,000 a month, where the median monthly payment for a nursing home is $5,000 a month, so that's a huge cost saving. But of course, part of this is because doing home care also requires lots of wraparound benefits to the families who are contracting home care workers. And so usually home care workers may not be full-time, so you have to have benefits for the families of these people who have paid sick that they can take off to do doctor's appointments, flexible scheduling, paid leave for longer-term leaves to help their family members. So it would require a lot of wraparound benefits if we're going to try to move to a system that had more expansive home care. And then home care workers also don't make a lot of money right now. Heidi and Jeff Hayes' analysis shows that they make a median of $22,000 a year, with 3/4 making less than $15 an hour, so they're not making living wages. And we really want the wages to be massively increased when we're expanding this care. And a lot of the wages for care workers, for home care workers as well, it replicates a lot of the divisions we see across the labor market. So people are paid less on gender, race, ethnicity, sort of replicating nativity, replicating the other disparities we see in the labor market. So if we want to expand this type of work, we really have to massively improve the pay for this. But even if we sort of take that $1,000 a month for home care versus $5,000 a month for institutionalized care, and we double that payment, we include the costs of wraparound services, I still think you could sort of make a rhetorical argument that this is still an efficient thing to be doing. And better care in the short term can hopefully reduce need for more intensive care in the long term if people are able to degenerate at a slower pace or just maintain a healthier life. And then really briefly, another example would be childcare. I think this is a pretty sort of direct example. On the first panel, Maria Floro talked about how governments view providing childcare as a sunk cost, but it clearly isn't and has huge benefits to society. We know that when women have access to high quality childcare and affordable childcare, that they increase their labor force participation. And we also know that for these women, being able to maintain your attachment to the labor force improves their lifetime earnings. That's sort of going to have the same sort of multiplier effects I've been talking about. It's going to have much more broader effects. One example is DC expanded pre-K for universal pre-K for all 3- and 4-year-olds. And when they did this, it increased the labor force participation of women in DC by 10 percentage points, which is just like a massive increase in women's labor force participation and maternal labor force participation. It costs the city about $200 million per year, but having 10% more women in the labor force is just massive. And DC is also trying to think, what's the next steps in this, and expanding subsidies for early childhood care, including provisions to pay these childcare workers more. So the DC bill that is being proposed would cap childcare costs at 8% of family income for a family of making $85,000 a year, and they predict this would cost under $500 million over 10 years. So it's about $5 million per year, or $50 billion per year. But it's not. But I think with this these two programs in DC bring up one sort of tension in talking about care and the importance of providing care is that it is a really personal choice for a lot of people. You do it through a lot of different methods. You can do it through direct provision of care from the government, or you can do it through government subsidies. And I think it's good to have a combination of these. And so the final point, too, is that not only would a lot of these care provisions improve the outcomes of care recipients in the long run, that would be productive, and also improve the outcome of people who have care needs in their families, so women who can engage more in the labor force because they have access to care for their family members. But the workforce of these populations is also women themselves, also often mothers themselves, often women of color, immigrant women. So it would have this huge effect. I mean, this is one of the things I think is one of the best development policies you can do is take a care workforce that is primarily women and pay them more, because it would have this huge effect on all these different aspects of women's equality in the economy. So those are some of my ideas. I'm looking forward to talking more.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Shara.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I'll just first like to begin by thanking the organizers, the American University in particular, Professors Nika Mures, Heidi Hartman, Sergi Floro, and our dear friend Shirin Aslan, who's made a lot of things possible, for the invitation and for being here. I'm going to try and sort of take a little bit our discussion to a broader, kind of more global picture, but I think there are a lot of continuities with the really interesting remarks that were already made by Kate. I just want to ask, how many of you know what the Commission on Status of Women is, CSW, or at least have heard of it? Okay, so the Commission on Status of Women is the kind of global body that meets once a year, just not too far from you in New York City, and it's supposed to be the prime policy-making body on women's rights issues and gender equality. Now, we're all very excited because every year there's a priority theme for Commission on Status of Women, and the priority theme for CSW 63, which is the one that takes place in March 2019, is making social protection, public services, and sustainable infrastructure work for women's empowerment. We think this is really exciting because potentially investments in social protection, public services, and infrastructure can be very transformative for the lives of millions of women and men and children around the world. And it can help lift their families out of poverty. For women in particular, it can give them a bit more voice and power within their intimate relationships, and the possibilities of having some fallback position in case those relationships break down, or if they have children and are left with the children on their own. This can be, a very important sort of fallback option. The implications of these investments in the three areas that we're talking about are wide-ranging, both in terms of women's income security and in terms of their kind of reproductive responsibilities and, unpaid care work as part of that. But it's also important, I think, to underline, and CSW, the way the priority theme has been framed, it really allows us to underline the interconnections between these different areas, and rather than see them in kind of a very siloed way, which is often done within sort of policymaking arenas. But also I really want to emphasize, before giving a little bit more detail, that investments in these three areas also have to work in tandem with economic policies that are needed to create jobs. And I'm thinking of macroeconomic policies in particular that do stimulate and create jobs and enable livelihoods, very importantly. But investments in these three areas, in social protection, or what I think in the US you talk about as social security, in social protection, in public services, and in infrastructure, although they're not a substitute for gender responsive economic policies, they do make very big economic contributions. So social policies, in a way, are investments that contribute to the economic domain in the same way that economic policies have very huge social implications and social content. So our categories, economic and social policy, as being kind of separate, are not, I would like to suggest that they actually have to work in tandem, and the dualism that we have and the way we separate them is not very helpful, because economic policies have huge social implications and social policies make huge economic investments and increase the productivity of the economy. So let me just give you a few examples to highlight what I mean by these interlinkages between the three areas working better, and also the interlinkages between the so-called social and the economic sort of policy sphere. So let's just take a sort of important form of social protection transfer. For many women, a lifetime of labor market disadvantage, working informally, being in and out of the labor market, or spending a lot of time not in the labor market because of other kinds of social and care responsibilities, often translates into women having very poor pension coverage alongside a kind of lack of savings and often a lack of assets or very weak forms of assets and savings, which means that having some kind of protection, income security during old age could actually be incredibly important. And yet we know even in the European Union, you have, for example, older women are 37% more likely than men to be living in poverty. And in most countries, women are less likely than men to receive a pension in their old age. And where they do receive a pension, the benefit levels are very often lower. And of course, I'm not suggesting that pension systems are the same everywhere. Pension design makes a huge difference when you have highly privatized individual accounts. That tends to work against sort of women's income security in old age. But despite these differences, which are very important to take into account, one thing that has become very clear is that the expansion of so-called non-contributory pensions, also known as social pensions, has been very important, particularly in many developing countries, in giving women access to an income of their own in old age. But also we have to be very careful not to see this as something that we then sort of forget about insurance-based pension systems, because contributory pensions tend to be more generous, and it's important that we make the kind of reforms that are needed to make contributory systems more gender responsive. For example, by having care credits, which a lot of countries have, which do count women's time out of the labor market when they're caring as a contribution in terms of the way in which they accumulate their pension savings for when they retire. So it's really important to see these two as having to work together and not one being a substitute for the other. We also need to be very, very clear about the changes that need to be made in terms of the contributory systems, even as we do advocate for social pensions, which are tax financed and can reach poorer women with, who have spent a lot of time outside of the so-called labor market. Another example, women also remain very poorly covered for gender-specific life course risks, and maternity is one of them. And I'm very aware that I'm talking in a country where paid maternity leave is an issue that still needs to be struggled for at the federal level. Globally, we know that only 41% of mothers who have newborns receive a maternity benefit, with women in informal employment often being routinely excluded from any such benefits, and that's a major issue in many developing countries. There's data from the recent ILO World Social Protection Report that shows that in sub-Saharan Africa, only something like 16% of women with newborns had access to paid maternity leave. And these are predominantly public sector employees probably, or the very few who work in the formal private sector. And bringing, of course, women in the informal economy, in particular women who work as domestic workers under the coverage of maternity coverage, is something that can be done more easily for informal wage workers, because at least there's an employer who can contribute in contributory systems, but it can also be done for women who are self-employed, but it has to be financed through government tax, governments have to basically finance it, so it has been more of a struggle, whereas we have more examples from middle-income countries that at least have expanded the coverage of maternity leave to include domestic workers or informal wage workers, particularly in Latin America. This has been more successful, as well as in South Africa for domestic workers. And if I can have, there's only a little slide. I only have 3 figures that I want to show. If we can have the slide put up, sorry. I just want to talk also about something which has been talked a lot about, which are these cash transfers, often conditional, that are given to women in their capacity as mothers. Sorry, no, we have to go back to the first one. Okay. So something we see here, this is some work, and Karen is there, that we did with the World Bank, who have access to this amazing database that has data for something like 89 countries' income and household surveys. And we were able to come up with a figure on, global sort of feminization of poverty. We've talked about it a lot, but we haven't had global figures to actually show what percentage of women are living in poor households compared to men. And this work allows us to sort of see that. And what is really interesting is not the overall numbers, but when you divide and look at age categories. And what is really interesting is that it's particularly in the 25 to 34-year-old age group where the gender gap in poverty is at its widest. And there's something like 122 women for every 100 men who live in, this is extreme poverty, who live in poor households. And this is interesting because these are both the prime productive years, when a lot of people are working and have children and need to earn more in order to provide for bigger families, but also the prime reproductive years when people do have young children. And it really kind of, I think, shows some of the struggles that women have in reconciling paid and unpaid work, where you see this kind of poverty increasing to such an extent. And family transfers have often targeted mothers through these conditional cash transfers, and they've become very important social protection instrument for enhancing the incomes of households with children. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of concern about the conditionalities that are often attached to these transfers that have come under considerable criticism because they ask women to do a lot of additional work, taking children to health centers, going for health checkups, doing other kinds of work. But I think what is also very interesting is when you look at some of the really good ethnographic research that has been done in, for example, I'm thinking of Peru on one of the programs, the Juntas program, the work done by Tara Cookson, which shows also that a lot of the times the problem is not so much the conditionalities, but the way in which the conditionalities require women who are getting these benefits to take their children to health centers and go for health checkups themselves. The problem being that at the same time, governments have not been investing in those services, in those public services. So women, indigenous women who have to make long walks to get to these health centers get there, and the health workers are not there, the health centers are closed. Even if they get in, the language that is spoken is not one that they can communicate in. The kind of treatment they get is not the best. So I think this really goes to show that we need these investments in so-called social protection transfers at the same time as investments in services. Otherwise, the failure for women to fulfill these conditionalities is not really their failure, but a failure on the part of the public sector in delivering the kind of quality services that are needed. And I think it really does highlight the interlinkages between social protection transfers and public services, quality, accessibility of those services, and their responsiveness to women's needs in particular. So the two really do need to work in tandem. And I think we can talk maybe later about the conditionalities, which are also a major concern and one that we would like to really take into the priority theme report for the next CSW and to raise some questions about the usefulness of these conditionalities. Turning very quickly to public services, again, another area that has been obviously one that is of major concern, not only to women's reproductive works, but also to being able to get themselves to markets, whether it's selling their produce or whether to be able to access where jobs are as opposed to, where they're living. We know that women use walking and public transport are much more important for them than for men. Women's travels in general are very complex. They're multi-purpose, resource constrained. There's fear of sexual harassment when they do use different transport modalities, and personal security are a great concern. And also women tend to suffer, low-income women in particular, from the high loss of employment opportunities in face of the fact that they cannot access where jobs are. Its access is not easy, and it's also quite costly and eats into the sort of meager resources that they can earn. So investments in public transport obviously remain very important. particularly for women. At the same time, we know that a lot of the investment tends to go into highways and bridge building and private cars, and there's a big sort of industry invested interest there, which works against kind of women. And just to quickly show you another sort of quick slide on women's access to another form of investment that remains for many poorer countries, in particular low-income countries, very important investments in having water close and on premises as opposed to having to walk long distances. And what you see here is data from the development, from the Demographic and Health Surveys, DHS, which shows that in households that don't have water on premises, 80% of those households, it's women and girls who do the fetching of water. And this is, a huge amount of time. And there has been a lot of research done and some really interesting studies that came out in a few years ago, looking at 9 countries, showed that where you had a water source that was closer or on the premises, it had a very positive impact on school rates, attendance for both boys and girls, so very important positive impact there, where you can see the efficiencies and the gains. Interestingly, it didn't have a very significant impact on women's income earning capacity, labor force participation. I think, it's very important to emphasize here that what it does, these kind of investments, at the least what it's doing is reducing the drudgery of the work that women have to do. But this idea that that will then enable them to have jobs and earn incomes, I think, really does point to the importance of investing at the same time on the demand side of the equation, the availability of jobs and livelihoods and options. It's not just enough to, release the labor supply, but also you need policies that do make jobs and livelihoods more viable and more available, and economies more vibrant in producing those opportunities. And finally, let me just turn to the last slide, which really picks up on the point that Kate was making about how investments in early childhood education and care can be great investments in terms of not only the reducing of women's unpaid care work time, increasing their availability and possibilities of seizing employment options, but also in creating jobs through the care sector itself. So here we did a little exercise. We took 2 countries, Uruguay and South Africa, and we looked at the amount of money that needs to be invested in order to make 0 to 5 early childhood education and care available to all children universally through the public sector, so no fees attached. This is the public sector providing those services. And what the implications are for child development, for also increasing the number of jobs that are created in the economy. And what the figures we came out with are quite interesting. And this shows the simulation exercise for South Africa only. And what it shows is that an investment of about 3% of GDP, and this is a significant investment, of course, would provide universal coverage for children 0 to 5. It would also create, only through the care sector, about 2.3 million jobs, this is in South Africa, which would increase female employment by more than 10 percentage points. So quite a significant increase in employment. But also very interestingly, something like 40% of the initial fiscal layout could be recuperated through the tax and transfer system. Once you have these people who are working and paying taxes, you get a recuperation of that, 40% of it. And this, of course, is just recuperation of the fiscal cost. It doesn't say anything about the kind of positive spin-offs that this can have, the kind of positive externalities it can have in terms of child development, school readiness, reduction in women's unpaid time, and therefore their capacities to access jobs and earn incomes and lift their own households out of poverty. Now, this is only for 2 countries, and I would really recommend that you look at the ILO report that is just out on the care economy, which has tried to do similar simulations on a much larger scale and shows the kind of jobs that can be created through the care sector. And I think it's really important that we think about that, and in particular at a time where we're concerned also about climate change and about creating jobs that are green jobs. I think care jobs are green jobs. They don't pollute, they don't have those kind of negative externalities, and they have many positive externalities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much. That certainly helped broaden our horizons. And now for even broader horizons, Karen Groen.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Can somebody do a thumbs up if you can?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, great. Great to be with you. Heidi asked us to focus on one favorite policy solution, and I have to confess that I don't have one. So, but I'm not going to talk about one of them because Shara did, which is the CARE Social Protection Infrastructure Network. But let me just add one thing to what Shara said that I think is really important. And this comes from the World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law database that comes out, is updated every 2 years, and is an amazing resource for legal economic discrimination that exists in countries. And just this last year, we looked at child care regulations across the 189 economies for which we have data. And we've done some analytic work with that. And the one thing that I wanted to add to what Shara said is the importance of moving from a system of maternity leave or paternity leave to a system of parental leave that has the right incentives for spouses to share leave. And there's some very interesting examples in the Nordic economies that we should really look to. And I mentioned parental leave because it's particularly important in terms of encouraging men to take up care. And when men take up care, that helps women to increase paid employment. So I think that's particularly important. My set of policies that I wanted to talk about are on, very complementary, are on financial inclusion and asset ownership. And like Shara, but maybe a little bit different than Shara, I'm not going to be speaking about high-income countries. I'm speaking particularly about low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. And when I think about, or when I talk about financial inclusion, it's not just about banks and a formal banking system. It's about a wider array of financial services and products, but it also includes associated policies that are really important, like identification, national identification systems. Of course, in the finance system, it involves credit, savings, but also access to insurance. And Shara talked about social insurance, but private insurance is important here, particularly for some segments of the population. It also involves policies regarding property rights and property laws. And I know that Bina mentioned this yesterday morning in terms of the rights to inherit land or housing. And it also involves infrastructure, which Shara touched on but didn't go into any detail. So what I'd like to do is just to give some of the context, and then I want to talk about the policy mix that I think is important. And I'm going to start with identification. Identification, having a foundational identity. When I say foundational identity, it's not necessarily identity for citizenship, it's just who you are. And we've done some work in the World Bank Group about the importance of identification. And there is a small gender gap in some regions and a bigger gender gap in other regions. But in sub-Saharan Africa, only 65% of women and 74% of men have an identification document. Of course, this goes to inadequate civil and vital registration services. It goes to the fact that countries just don't have coverage. And this is particularly important for those individuals who don't have access to finance, are unbanked. So 25%, for instance, of unbanked adults in sub-Saharan Africa actually report lack of documentation as a barrier to accessing finance. With respect to account ownership, I've pulled some data from something called the Findex. This is a data set that the World Bank manages. It's a joint effort with Gallup, and we survey, again, in 189 economies, people's ability to have credit accounts, credit checking accounts, savings accounts, mobile banking accounts, and a different access to and use of different types of financial products. And the latest data from the Findex is pretty pessimistic for somebody like me. We've been collecting this data since 2011, 2014, now 2016 and 2018, and the gender gap in access to financial services has actually not budged. Globally, it's about 7 percentage points between men and women. For developing countries, it's about 9 percentage points. There has been some change overall in terms of increases in financial inclusion for men and women together, but the gender gap has not changed. And to just give you some examples, in some countries, for instance, in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, the gender gap in access to finance has actually increased. I think you probably have heard from Bina and others about issues with respect to gender gaps in ownership of immovable property, land, and housing. I have to say here that I don't think we have global numbers because countries have not yet collected the sex disaggregated data on all forms of ownership. There's some attempts that started with the Gender Asset Gap Project, Cheryl Doss, Carbon Nadir, Hema Swaminathan, and others, to carry forward the measurement agenda, but we're not there yet. Although I have to say that both UN Women, the World Bank Group, FAO, and others is making some big efforts to try to help countries and UN statistics to help countries put in place systems to collect better data. So that just gives you a picture of some of the context. So what can actually help? And what I wanted to focus on in terms of the policy mix is digital finance. And that digital finance involves infrastructure, it involves regulatory challenges, it requires associated changes in family and inheritance laws, it requires identification systems, and other things. And I focus on digital finance and digital technology because I think that approaches that rely on digital technology can really help close key gender gaps. But I have to say that we have an infrastructure gap, if you will, that already exists. So fewer women than men in the countries where we work own mobile telephones. And we all know the importance of mobile money that has grown. Probably have heard about examples like M-Pesa in Kenya and Tanzania. But I have to say that from the latest data from the GSMA Foundation, which works with the telecom operators, shows that 84% of men versus 74% of women do have mobile phones. And I have to say the gap in mobile phone ownership is even greater among the unbanked population. But there's also gaps in access between men and women to the internet. 37% of women versus 45% of men in the surveys that the bank and others have done have internet access. And again, lack of internet access is even more severe among the unbanked population. So we have to figure out how we're going to close the gaps in just the access to these types of technology, which are really, really important. And there's some really interesting innovations by the private sector, for instance, but I think policy has a role to help. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So the foundation, I think, for digital finance involves setting up national ID systems. There are some very interesting models that have been set up by governments of Pakistan and India. Aadhaar is probably the most one of the most interesting and well-known models, and it's not without its limitations regarding individual privacy and security. Although the Indian government just ruled on this, but many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are really trying to think about how to put in place digital identification systems. In the area of finance, there's a number of policy reforms that I think are really important. Particularly, let me just mention a few with respect to credit. We need policies that will help women build credit histories. So for instance, through tiered know your customer requirements, this takes legislative change. We need things like movable collateral registries to help women overcome immovable collateral constraints, because in many countries they don't own or inherit immovable property, but movable collateral registries are very promising. And we need a number of actions, I think, to help collect the data from the banking industry. One of the things that we started to do is to work with the IMF that has something called the Financial Access Survey to get central banks to ask domestic banks in their countries to report sex disaggregated data, so we have more supply-side data on the magnitude of the gender gap. There's much more to be done in terms of government policy to help families and women in particular have access to savings products and services, as well as insurance products and services. There's a lot of the regulatory changes differ by country, but there's a number of them that can be explored, which we're exploring. Some of these are mentioned in the Women Business and the Law database that I mentioned. We've learned a lot about how we can do policy change with respect to property rights so that women can own and inherit land and housing. It involves the kind of reforms that countries like Kenya and Uganda have moved toward, particularly in their constitutions as well as in statutory law. But there's a lot that can be done in terms of actual creation of property registries, countries that are engaged in land reform and setting up titling schemes. We know a lot about things like joint titling, and countries like Lesotho, Philippines, and Vietnam have moved in that direction. But I want to focus particularly on the digital side now, and in terms of what we do. I think that the digital agenda spans three areas where policy change and practice is needed. The first is obviously the infrastructure. We need the broadband and we need the satellite and the connectivity. But digital solutions span some of the sectors that Shara actually mentioned: social protection, the payment of government wages, and payment systems in countries. And these all have gender dimensions. So let me just give you an example with respect to social protection. Several countries have digitized their cash transfers, their social protection payment systems. Actually, 80 million women in South Asia have opened accounts at financial institutions in order to receive government transfers. So you're talking about countries like Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. These are not yet perfect systems, but they're actually really important to help women become financially included. With respect to payment of government wages, for instance, government public employees, 30 million women have actually opened accounts, their first accounts, to collect their wages. And this is, again, led by countries in South Asia, but countries in sub-Saharan Africa are not far behind. And of course, there's many platforms that are being developed to set up payment systems, transaction systems for sale of agricultural products or for paying utility bills. So these payment platforms are really, really important. And this may sound controversial in this audience, but public-private approaches to these digital platforms, I think, is particularly important. Governments are also starting to do things like digitize business registration procedures, license fee payments. All of these things can actually be helpful to women entrepreneurs. And it's not that there's fully benefits, there's also risks. Some of the benefits for digital systems and digital platforms is research that my colleague Leora Clapper has done in Bangladesh shows that women who receive their wages through digital finance are more likely to have their money appropriated by their husbands or their mother-in-law or other relatives, and it gives them greater privacy and security than accepting cash and then being bombarded when they leave the factories. This is among garment workers. It can lower the high cost of informal savings to women. It can increase access to formal credit markets, and it can reduce the time cost. I was in India a few months ago talking to health workers who travel actually quite long distances to other villages. This is in the state of Bihar, to banks to deposit their accounts, and moving to digital finance would help reduce those kinds of costs. There are huge risks still, as I had mentioned previously, in terms of data privacy and security. The regulatory agenda involves having very strong consumer protection frameworks, and this is something that not all countries are yet equipped to do. It also means having a regulatory environment that will integrate the banking and or have greater linkages between the banking and telecommunications sector, particularly regarding taxation issues, the know your customer rules, the digital identification system. So I think that going forward, probably in 20 years, we're going to see much more of a digital economy, and we really have to think about how we're going to make this work for all people, men and women, and the public side has a big role to play, particularly in ensuring that the benefits of the digital economy are shared, that there's an inclusive system, and that includes that women are not left behind. So I'll stop there.
So I think we'd like to move to Q&A on these first three presentations because their subject matter is quite related. Just to sum up, Kate talked a lot about subsidies that are needed to support caring labor, both for children, elders, and disabled adults. Shara followed that up with more of a worldview, talking about more public subsidies for greater income support, especially for vulnerable families. It also included public infrastructure, which involved putting more people on the public payroll. So again, more public support. And Karen talked about more access for women, including female entrepreneurs, to financial products, especially through digitalization, but it also included more public regulation, which means more public workers on salary, but a lot more opportunity for real public-private partnerships. So we're happy to hear your comments, questions, and get some discussion going on those three. While you're thinking, is this on? Do I see any? We have the brain dead post lunch. This is the last session. Let me out of here. Mika.
So I had a question and a comment on Shahra's point specifically about the conditionalities. So that makes total sense to me, but I feel like dropping the conditionalities is like saying, oh, well, you can't take the kids to the doctor, so too bad, never mind. So I wonder if there's a way to use the conditionalities as like a crowbar to, get the centers staffed better or whatever. I mean, I'm sure somebody else has thought about this. I'm just asking whether, if that's not an option on the table. And then my little tiny comment is just about the water thing, water and employment. So I read some interesting studies about this issue, that you can radically reduce the amount of time women need to spend collecting water. So some of the studies that I looked at showed that what happened was instead of, walking hours to collect water and then coming back, the water's just down the street now, but instead of collecting once a day, women were reporting that they would collect like 15 times a day because now it's right there. So basically the family use of water just increased because of the additional time. And so it seems like there's also this thing about employment and norms and thinking about women's roles that has to kind of go along with that, freeing up the time. Otherwise it might just get sucked back into the same kinds of uses that were being used before.
Okay, while you're thinking for more comments, Shara.
Yeah, thank you, Mika. On the conditionalities, I mean, I think the really important point, I think, to say is that and there's been quite a lot of research on these conditional cash transfers. There hasn't been any research that I've seen, and I know others who follow this literature who kind of have confirmed that, any research that shows that the conditionalities, there are a lot of benefits that happen as a result of the cash transfers in terms of children's schooling, improvements particularly in nutritional levels, girls doing much better. And what is lacking is a research that shows that it's the conditionalities per se, as opposed to the additional injection of cash into the household that enables those positive outcomes. So there isn't much evidence to show the additional benefits of having conditionalities, because you get many of the same positive outcomes in the few cash transfer programs that have been studied which don't have conditionalities. So it's really a lack of evidence for the added value, and a lot of research showing the problems with the conditionalities. I take your point, but I think a lot of the my kind of gut reaction would be to say that a lot of mothers do want to take their children
Right,
to health centers.
I didn't mean it like that. I meant
Yeah,
that
sorry.
politically, so the problem is that
Yeah,
the
it's
governments don't
political.
staff the clinics, right? So politically, can't we use this as a crowbar to say, hey, staff the clinics?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, and I think that was exactly the point. And some of the people who initially put in conditionalities, I remember talking to the German GTZ when they said, well, the point of these conditionalities is that governments have co-responsibilities. And what this means is that once women are getting the cash and they're going to be able to go to the health centers and demand services, then there will have to be, the government will have to do its side of the contract as well. But in a way, that hasn't happened, and maybe it is very important to use what we know in order to make that push for saying we need also parallel investments in services. And I think what you said about water, very important. And I also don't think, I hadn't heard about the time that will be, that there won't be much time savings if the water is not so far anymore. But what we do know is that it's the carrying of very huge quantities of water that is particularly debilitating on, people's bodies and muscles and joints and everything else. So so I think there's a lot to be done about that.
Can I come in on this question?
Please.
I'm not sure I heard it entirely, but I might have somewhat of a different, or maybe other perspective to add into this. There have been some random control designs of the in the introduction of conditional cash transfers in some countries in Africa that I think do show where the value of the conditionality comes in, particularly in terms of the development benefits, whether they're conditionalities based on girls going to school or kids getting vaccinated or so forth. And that work has been done by Sarah Baird and Burke Osler. And there has been some important work, I think, done by IFPRI and others, comparing between conditional and unconditional cash transfers, and the evidence there is actually rather mixed. But I think that there's not totally kind of a blanket view in this literature. I do think the evidence is a little bit, from my read of it, a little bit more nuanced.
Kate, any remarks, questions for each other, comments?
Yeah, it's not black and white, but it's definitely not. I don't think it is pointing to the additional costs that have been imposed as a result of the conditionalities. I don't think the evidence, you're right. It is a little bit, I would say, mixed, but the mixed is not to the point that it does really justify the addition of the conditionalities, I would say. It depends how you look at it. I would look at it, but it's not sufficient enough to impose something that has been quite costly in terms of time and in terms of people just being, struck off because they haven't fulfilled the conditionalities in some cases. But I think where the argument for the conditionalities has been made a little bit, I think, somewhat more persuasive is by people like Hania Sholkami, who have argued that very often, sometimes the conditionalities help women within the intra-household arena in order to justify why they want to use the cash for certain sort of child-related expenditures rather than other household needs. So in terms of the intra-household, sort of increasing women's, voice within the household. So that I think, one can look at that a bit more positively. But anyway, others will have views on this, as it is a very contested issue.
Should we take the next comment?
Thank you. My name's Yolanda. I'm from Swinburne in Melbourne, Australia. Taking that word impose and with the CSW that you mentioned earlier, that is the only body in the world to set international policy. Can you talk a little bit about how that's been working for the last 63 years and what has actually worked? Because if we look at the data, it tells us that the majority of us first world so-called developing economies, our gender gap is actually getting bigger. So I'm just wondering how those CSW policies maybe we can use that bar, that stick, and hit more governments over the head? I don't know. I'd love your opinion on that.
If I could just interject for a minute and just say that the Commission on the Status of Women from the United Nations is not observed by all countries. The United States doesn't observe it, but it does give the right to the Commission to send delegations to member countries, comment on what they're doing right and wrong, and how they can achieve the UN goals. So they came to America and they wrote a report, and we scored very, very badly. You will not be surprised to hear. And I think it's safe to say that it was largely ignored because it sounded very idealistic to us, even though it may be normal in most of the world that our members, we just have a very funny attitude about, oh my God, don't tell me about Sweden again. The last thing we want to hear is that anyone in another country is doing something better than us, because after all, we are America, and we have our own unique exceptionalism, and that's true throughout all administrations. So, I just remember when they came and talking to them, and then what the general reaction was. But it's a very significant thing in most of the world, so it is something you might like to address.
One thing I'd like to say is that although we do talk a lot about the so many shortcomings and where there's been so much stagnation and not progress, I do think if we look sort of globally, there are some issues on which there has been progress. It's a fact. We can, of course, question the quality of the education, but education is one area where there has been quite a lot in terms of progress on gender equality. I think globally, if you look at the way gender gaps looked and what they look like now, and in some regions, in many countries, women even have surpassed men in terms of, at least enrollment and access to education, even tertiary education. We can question how much that education has opened doors within the labor market and how much of that so-called human capital is being translated into equality in terms of wages. So a lot there to talk about. But there are areas in which there has been progress, but more specifically to talk about the Commission on Status of Women, it's a very politicized body. No matter what the priority theme is, the priority theme could be on rural women, or it could be on social protection, or it could be on digital inclusion. Very often, unfortunately, the negotiations become very focused on a few issues on which we have had no progress, and those issues are sexual and reproductive rights. Now, search me how you link that to all the themes, but it comes up every time. The definitions of, or even the mention of the word families versus family, sexual orientation, gender identities. These are the issues that often get negotiated on, and there's a lot of north-south tensions. Very often, and we see what happens this year, but very often the whole Latin American group has been very good in terms of standing up to the kind of polarization that happens with, a lot of the European countries, and up to now the US, now I think it's going to be different, pushing on sexual and reproductive rights, but not necessarily listening to the group of 77 and many developing countries who also have demands in terms of right to development, in terms of responsibilities of high-income countries to pay ODA, aid contributions that they should be paying according to at least, certain norms that exist, international norms. So the kind of global justice, global economic justice issues versus sort of issues around sexual and reproductive rights and gender identity become the things over which these negotiations happen. And Latin America so far has played, as a group, has played a very positive role in terms of trying to move away from this polarization, and they recognize and have been very good advocates on sexual and reproductive rights, on talking about diversity of families rather than just the family, but at the same time also talking about issues of global economic justice, the way in which the global economy is not working for a whole series of countries, the responsibilities of the developed countries to play their role, the negative impacts of illicit financial flows in terms of disabling and not allowing governments to mobilize domestic resources to finance all of these things that we think are really important. So that's kind of a little bit the state of the play in CSW. Yeah.
Thank you. Karen, did you want to add anything?
No, I think the question was about CSW, so I'll let Shara handle that.
No, okay, great. So I think we're going to turn to our last speaker, John, and then we'll come back for more sum up and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Mika and to Heidi and the other organizers of the conference for the chance to be here today. I'm very happy. I realize I probably haven't. To be able to talk to you. When Heidi first reached out about this particular session, she said, suggested, as Karen said, that we pick one big idea. And I thought of one, and I'll tell it to you in a minute, but as I was coming here this morning, I realized I had a giant knot in my stomach, and it was unusually not about speaking in public. It was about the last 6 weeks or so, and the fact that next Tuesday, there's going to be a big election, which I think probably has more impact than anything I'm about to say on gender equality going forward than almost anything else I can imagine. So I just encourage everybody that has a chance to vote, please do vote, and I think hopefully will set us in the right direction. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. My one big idea for promoting gender equality, and I'm not going to suggest it is the only solution, that it's a partial solution, but I think it's an important part, is the idea of collective bargaining and a massive expansion of collective bargaining in the United States, which I think can go at least an important way towards addressing gender equality issues at the workplace. I want to spend a couple minutes each on 4 points. The first one is that collective bargaining has the capacity to give large economic advantages to women. Second, that collective bargaining can, in fact, help close the gender wage gap and other kinds of gender gaps at work. Third point I want to make is that, in general, the union movement in the United States, the labor movement, has faced tremendous challenges over the last 5 decades or so, but there are some reasons for optimism. And finally, I just want to make a couple suggestions for concrete steps that we could take to help expand collective bargaining in this country. So on that first point, I think collective bargaining, as probably many of you know, has a big positive impact on women in an absolute sense. If you're a woman in a union, comparing yourself to other women who are just like you but not in a union, you make a lot more money, and there's a lot of other advantages. I'll just go through it quickly. At this point, I wish I could press a button and just show you several minutes of a presentation that was in an earlier session that some of you might have seen by my colleague Julia Wolf, who did a much better and more succinct presentation of union advantages than I'm about to do, but I will try to riff on her work. So as my colleagues at the Economic Policy Institute have shown, women in a union make about 9% more than women who are not in a union with similar characteristics. As Cherie Buckner, my former colleague at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, has documented, these advantages are bigger for African American women, bigger for Latino women, bigger for immigrant women than they are for than this average figure overall. The other thing that I think unions do in collective bargaining is increase very substantially the likelihood that workers have access to employer-provided health insurance. They also significantly expand the access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. And those 3 things together, wages and benefits in the form of health and retirement, are extremely important, and women are underrepresented in terms of access to those things, and the difference really makes it's an important difference with the union context. But there's other advantages that I think are important, and they're not as well documented because we don't have good gender disaggregated data on things like access to paid vacation, access to paid holidays, access to paid parental leave. And in all of those cases, collective bargaining agreements do a lot of, make a big difference in terms of access. And that's an important thing, as I think has been mentioned earlier, because the distribution of care work is so one-sided. As a result, the access to things like vacation time, holiday time, paid parental leave makes a disproportionate benefit for women. And 2 related issues that I think that are less covered is the idea, I think sometimes, that collective bargaining is a very good way of implementing fair scheduling. I think there's a big movement now in many parts of the country to have fair scheduling laws, which I think are very important. But collective bargaining is a way to do that very directly and to focus it and tailor it to the needs of a specific workplace. So I think there's potentially a lot of advantages. And another one that I think ties in very closely and importantly to the Me Too movement is the idea that most collective bargaining agreements, essentially almost all, have some sort of just cause provision. that gives women the ability to the right to, if they're going to be dismissed, have just cause for doing that, so they're less subject to the arbitrary decisions of an employer about, and gives them more leverage to resist things like sexual harassment and other forms of gender discrimination. So that's the first point. I think there's large economic advantages in an absolute sense for women. The second point, and this goes to the moving towards gender equality, is I think that collective bargaining is a framework that can provide an important channel for closing gender gaps at work. And I'm not going to go through the statistics here. I just want to give you three kind of reasons why that could be true, because I think the reasons are as helpful as the data in this particular case. First one is that collective bargaining agreements disproportionately help people at the middle and the bottom of the wage distribution, and that is where women are in the wage and other employment distributions. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. A second reasoning is that collective bargaining provides a formal mechanism that, for representation in an employer context. So women who are, as I mentioned earlier, say subject to sexual harassment are not confronting their company, their employer, their boss as an individual, but doing it in a joint context where there is a lot of legal backing and institutional support. And then the third thing, and I think is arguably probably the most important, and this was very well put by my colleague Julia this morning, that the thing about a collective bargaining agreement is that it significantly limits the degree of employer discretion in hiring, in pay, and in promotions. And what that also means is it's limiting the scope for gender and other forms of discrimination because there's less of a capacity to leave it to the employer's discretion. So I think those three are reasons, are good ideas of why you could imagine that collective bargaining could help. The third thing I wanted to say to you today is that in the aggregate, I think the labor movement has faced a lot of challenges over the last 5 decades. That's not a big surprise. But I do think that there are reasons for optimism. The first reason for optimism is that women are an increasing share of the unionized workforce. In 1979, about 30% of all union workers in the United States were women, and now it's about 45%. And we are on a path to have a majority union, female dominated, or majority union movement sometime in the next 10 years. And that is largely a reflection of the fact that many of the largest sector in the economy right now in terms of unionization is the public sector, which is very heavily female, as you know. So I think that that gives hope for this mechanism to be more responsive to the needs of women going forward than has possibly been in the past. And I think it's also important to emphasize that there's strong representation in the labor movement now among African American women, Latina women, and immigrant women, a particularly important part of the labor movement going forward. A second reason I think to be optimistic is that overwhelmingly the barriers to expanding collective bargaining coverage in the United States are related to law and public policy, which means we have the ability to address them. This isn't a story about trade, globalization, technology, making it impossible to have unions. There are unions in Western Europe, for example, that have much higher unionization rates than we do. There are Nordic countries that have seen very little declines in unionization over the last 40 or 50 years, in a few cases even somewhat increases. They're dealing with the same trade and technology questions we are. They are answering them in much better ways through public policy. So I think that those two factors, the fact that I think women are on the rise within the labor movement and the fact that we can address some of these public policy questions well. And I just want to give two quick examples of what some of the problems that we need to face are. One is, it's very easy in the law right now, it's against the law, but it's very easy to fire workers who are trying to organize a union. Kate Bronfenbrenner did some research a few years ago that showed in about 1/3 of all cases where there's an organizing drive, employers fire the workers. Now, this is illegal, but it costs basically nothing to the employer to do that. They can target strategically specific workers, the ones that are organizing and fire them. It undermines the organizing movement and intimidates everybody else. And if they are found guilty at some point down the line for doing this illegal behavior, their responsibility is to pay back pay to that worker or those small group of workers. But it's a very cheap union avoidance scheme if it's followed. A second way that I think public policy undermines the labor movement now is right to work, which is which basically is a so-called right to work, which basically puts the responsibility of representing all of the workers at a workplace on the union, but allows employers not to allows workers not to contribute to that, which causes tremendous problems for the union's ability to be viable economically. So let me, the last thing I want to say in the brief amount of time I hope I have left is that it's possible to turn this around. And I feel like this is, I want to make two concrete suggestions. One is conceptually very easy, and that is just to restructure labor law and public policy so that it makes it easier for the 60% or so of workers who say they want to be in a union to actually be in a union instead of the 11 or 12% that we have right now. My colleagues Celine McNicholas and Heidi Scherholz have a very good program called First Day Fairness, which includes elements of exactly the specific kinds of things we could do. It include restrictions on employer intimidation and retaliation, and end to right to work and other kinds of policies. But that's conceptually easy, but it's going to be hard to do in practice. The thing that's conceptually hard, but I think is actually more important, is that the labor movement has to become a social movement in the way that, say, the women's movement was in the 60s and 70s, or the civil rights movement was in the 50s and 60s. And that is exactly when we saw big increases in unionization in the United States in the 1930s, when it was a social movement. What that would mean today is that kind of workers of all genders, but especially white, Black, Latina, African American, Native American, and immigrant women would be at the core and at the center of what this resurgent labor movement looks like. And I think that that's really hard to figure out how that's going to happen, but I'm a little bit optimistic because of the Chicago teacher strike in 2012 and the strikes we've just seen in Arizona, West Virginia, and Oklahoma, which are deeply red states where workers have finally said, we're going to stick together and we're going to fight back. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I just have a few comments to make to try to sum things up. This has been a very rich and far-reaching discussion to end our great convening. And my comments are about, what is the purpose of economics? This is something our discipline could spend a lot more time gazing at our navel and trying to answer. But I was always taught that it was the study of the allocation of scarce resources. I think that's something that's familiar to us from introductory economics. And it does remind me of one of my mother's favorite childhood settings. My mother is a German immigrant who came in 1938, and she really doesn't have a lot of American sayings that she repeats over and over again, like many parents do. But this one was, Heidi, the world does not owe you a living. And I always thought that that was wrong, because I am here, and if the world doesn't owe me a living, who does? And someone must owe me a living, because why else would I be here? And so, fortunately, recently, belatedly, I came across a contribution from feminist economics, which answers the question. And this is from Marilyn Power, and I'm sure it's, something she's expressed that all of us have been contributing to. And she says, why don't we think about economics as the study of provisioning? So, when you say it's the allocation of scarce resources, you immediately go to the market, because the market is how we allocate scarce resources. And who owns the resources that have to be allocated is pretty much out of the picture. It's just that they bring it to the market, and then you have dollar votes. How do you get the dollar votes? Well, who knows? But you have the dollar votes, you can buy the products or not. So if you look at it as the study of social provisioning, well, then it's a social good, and where does it come from, and how do we make it, and how do we make sure everyone is provided for? And, all of these talks today are very much in that mode, because what unions are doing is they're saying, well, a good part of the wage is a social wage. It's your meeting a minimum living standard, it's your health care, your social insurance, your job protection, your access to the political process. We increase that for you if you're a union member. And so I think a lot of the questions that we have about what's wrong with economics, and there's a lot wrong with economics, really come down to how we define it and whether we could see things more in terms of social provision. And of course, the public sector gets its revenue through taxation, has been the main way that we have provided for this social provisioning. And of course, one of the things the conservative movement has tried to instill everywhere is tax revolutions and tax ceilings, to try to keep the size of the public sector down. And what we've heard today really from all four speakers is that the size and strength and the value of the public sector is extremely important to being able to provide the social provisioning. Because you require, we talk about now what the state does is, the state protects private property. Where did the private property come from? We don't care. We just want the state to protect it. But it does come from somewhere. And, the purpose of the state is to protect a lot of things. And I think that we can make it really focus on social provisioning and the role of the public sector in ensuring that social provisioning. So that would be my 2 cents, and I think that it's a framework to look further at, and I'm sorry I neglected it for so long, but I think that, if we have some comments from this table, that would be great, and any final comments from any of you, that would be wonderful, and then we would be ending a little bit early, so thank you.
I maybe have a very sort of general comment. I really love that article on social provisioning. I think it is something that everyone should read, and if anyone's teaching a course on gender and economics, it's something you have students read on day one. But I think this sort of gets to, I do a lot of navel-gazing about economics and why it's important to have more diversity of voices and thoughts and perspectives in economics, because the idea of economics as being the allocation of resources, it's not a coincidence that mainstream economic theory is set up the way it does to maintain the current unequal structures we have. It's because the people making economic theory primarily have been people who have a lot of resources, and they've created a theory that is not truth. It's just a theory that says that we should keep it this way, so resources are still allocated in this way. And so I think that's why having sort of a broader group of people engaging in economics, people who care about social justice, who care about economic justice, who care about reproductive justice, all these different issues, care about human rights, engaged in creating economic theory and economic debates sort of changes the perspective of what we care about in economics and why we do it, and focusing it back on social provisioning.
Sarah, you want to add anything?
I love that article, and I loved your closing remarks, that we really do need to think about economics as the study of social provisioning, but also I think we need to think of the economy and economics and how it's governed. I think who governs the markets and who makes the economic decision making does take us very much to the political questions. And I do want to sort of say, to go back to John's point about the importance of having the kind of politics that will allow us, the majority of people, to have an economy that actually does provide and does support social provisioning is ultimately a political issue. And I think that is also something that as a political economist, I think it's really, really important to emphasize, and who actually has the axis of decision making, and whether democracies really do have choices, and whether they're given the kind of choices that are needed to make the kind of policies that the majority of people want is the big question, I think. Not just in the US on Tuesday, but I think globally as well.
Karen, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, let me just say 3 things. The first is that I think actually the rise of technology and digital inclusion, the rise of social media in particular, has lifted the aspirations of so many people in so many places that hadn't seen the way a lot of people live in our countries. And I think this issue of rising aspirations is very much part of social provisioning, and we really need to think through the issues of inequality, which are a much more part of economic policy, and some of the major institutions are moving toward embracing, understanding the role that inequality plays and how to reduce inequality. So I think that's really important. The second thing I wanted to say is that for those of you, particularly the students who are interested in connecting research to policy, I think it's a hugely rich area. I think there's lots to be done, and I don't think, even when I was a professor, I appreciated the extent of work on the minutia of policy. and getting into that and how that affects behavior, how that affects who's in people's entitlements and other things. So I think really doing better policy analysis is really important. And the final thing I would say is I mentioned 2 data sets at the beginning of my remarks, the Findex and Women, Business, and the Law. I really think that as a profession, we need to collect more and different types of data than we have done previously in the past. This is really the case at the micro level. And I know particularly at AU, the Program on Gender Analysis and Economics is a strong focus on doing better data collection. But I think this is also the case in terms of macroeconomics, in terms of behavioral economics, and I think also connecting data sets that haven't been connected before, as Professor Floro mentioned yesterday, bringing time use data into macroeconomic data is something that I think would be this is the kind of fruitful exploration. So for those of you out there, don't be content to sit and use a US Census data set or something else, but really think about the kind of data that might be needed to answer the kinds of questions about social provisioning that we need.
Thank you very much. John, want to say anything?
Just a quick thought that I think one of the things that's running through a lot of all of these conversations, I think, is the issue of democratic control. And whether that's in the provisioning of social services or the way care work is provided, and both who gets it and how it's provided. Also, the issue of technology. I think there's so much in the discussion about technology. It's not the technology in and of itself, but it's our relationship to that technology and how it's controlled. And I'd say the same thing is true in the context of collective bargaining and unions. Unions are very imperfect, but they are democratic in the best of circumstances. And I think that is something that gives some opportunity to bring not just democracy into the context of a union, but democracy into the context of the actual workplace. So hopefully on Tuesday we'll get some more democracy.
And I think John means democracy with a small d there. But, a lot of people ask, is it possible to have small d democracy in the United States, given all of the imperfections, the wide use of large money, and we're seeing so much voter suppression right now? But it's the only democracy we've got. So it does behoove us, I think, to try very hard to fight for what we've got and to try to expand it and to go to the polls on Tuesday. So with that, I'm going to close this wonderful session. And I just want to say that all the people that started working on the conference that were friends are still friends. And that's a great achievement. And thank you all for coming.